All right, everyone. Welcome again to the Equal Justice Podcast. The Equal Justice Podcast is a forum for all those who seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and a just society. I'm joined again with Jacob Daniel, Logan Zeppieri, and Josh Matayka. How you guys doing today? Everybody all right? Josh, are you excited that I can now pronounce your name?
I'm ecstatic that you're saying it the right way. Not Matayka, not.
Although Matayka,
I don't know how else you say it.
Have a nice ring. Makes you more Japanese, perhaps, than
yeah, exactly.
But
gotta spice it up sometimes.
So
I just learned that you're the only Josh Matayka.
Yes, the only Josh Matayka in the world. So for all you stalkers out there, just
right.
I'll be your target for the group.
Yeah,
8 mil can go to one place.
Yeah,
it's like Hunger Games, like I volunteer. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you are the one, that's for sure. Because there's millions of Logan Zeppieris out there.
Oh, right.
Logan will get confused over and over again.
Oh yeah.
So, anyways, on to more serious business, I suppose. Today we are going to be looking at again one of the maybe two or three major issues or seemingly major issues in the church right now, critical race theory, something we've spoken about in the past. But today I think we wanted to take more of an in-depth look at the theory itself, at some of the movements that it has spawned. But we also wanted to try and answer, at least get some clarity on the question of, for those in the church who seem to be wanting to embrace, whether it be sort of the popular level exposition of CRT with authors like maybe Robin DiAngelo or Ibrahim Kendi, or the older critical race theory scholars. I'm thinking like Derek Bell, some people whose names will come up as sort of the more the Kimberly Crenshaws, the originators, which goes back 30 or 40 years now at least. And the question we're going to try and explore is, okay, is this all just theory? Or, where does the real action take place? Where does the real activism occur? What things are people really looking to change? In other words, does the dog have any bite? So Jacob, why don't you start us off with just some initial thoughts on that question of, is this pure theory, or does it have some real bite to it? And are people actually going to make some real changes in the church?
Great, yeah. Before I do that, I just want to plug one of our episodes that will be published very soon. I recently did an interview, a podcast interview with Dr. Glenn Sunshine. Mm-hmm. He's professor of history at the Central Connecticut University. And this is the exact question we've been dealing with there more in detail in terms of whether the church should adopt any aspect of critical race theory. So I just wanted to plug that, and also to mention to our audience that we've been doing a lot of recent episodes on this very topic of critical race theory. So please go and look it up and subscribe to our channel as well. So this is how I understand the issue with critical race theory is. In the past, we understood as collective enterprise that there are certain structures that has been put up. Mainly as Christians, we think that these are, in some sense, a transcendent structures in that family, church, and government. But there are other substructures as well. So throughout history, our attempts had been to direct these structures to the right end. Whereas with critical race theory, the issue is that we are dismantling these structures, wanting to redefine it, without giving any promise as to what we want to replace it with. The picture that we get is one of replacement with no guarantee as to what we are replacing it with, would not end up doing the same thing that we are questioning with the current structure. So in that, I see that it's not merely in terms of theoretical ideas, but there's an intentional effort to dismantle these structures, and it has practical consequences that the church as well as people in general must understand. And there are many, regardless of different disciplines, regardless of different faith, regardless of even a lot of atheists understanding the importance of the danger of dismantling these structures as a practical outcome of critical race theory. Giving into such a kind of pressure over culture would have its own consequences, which I believe we're going to talk about in detail today.
Right. And one of those structures that obviously seems to be fundamentally connected to critical race theory is the structure of the family. Yes. We saw that was on, for example, part of the Black Lives Matter mission statement for a long time until they took it down. I don't know if it's been put back up there, but that was obviously an area of contention for at least some Christians.
Do you know what the motivation for that was, for taking it down off the BLM website? Because I heard about that recently as well, that they removed it.
I mean, I'd only be speculating, but just that it was unpopular and hurting their cause or something. Although I think that they, what it says, what it looks like to me is you take it down because you're losing popularity, but that doesn't mean you still aren't pushing for it. Right.
My understanding is that one of the motivations that could be there is the kind of, so what was happening with the way CRT was being adopted within the church without questioning much, or without understanding its origins, without understanding the effects that it would have on our culture. People were giving into it emotionally. But eventually, as they realized these set of values and principles were questioning the very fundamental value of Christian faith at the end, the very structure of a nuclear family. The idea of nuclear family is God's idea. The first family was a nuclear family. But the Black Lives Matter was very intentional, I believe, in attacking the very structure of nuclear family, in that because the whole idea rests on a collective enterprise, as I said, a collective lived experiences of people where you identify with groups, not stand as individuals. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that BLM the organization ever released a statement on why they removed that portion. To answer Josh directly, I don't. So I think all of it's going to have to be speculation. And sure. I think once you get into more of the scholarship and of CRT, I think, again, speculating that they sort of overplayed their hand and kind of saying we should also fight against the judicial family. I think that's underlying the entire debate, is one of the aspects that they do want to see, sort of how they would probably put it is like moved beyond. I think that's actually how BLM put it, but something about, transcending these certain traditional norms, such as the traditional family. So I think they kind of overplay their hand in a cultural level and says, we should retract that, even though I do think that is very much within line of their philosophical project.
Right.
I think there's a level. I think they were losing their base as well within the Christian camp.
It's a political movement.
And that did have an impact in terms of their decision. I think so. Just like the way we are seeing with big techs today.
Right.
They took some decisions, and now there's a backlash.
Backlash from Europe.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah. Well, and that is typical. And that is telling, I think, of. And it should be a warning to Christians to what kind of organizations and institutions we're willing to endorse or sidle up to, because it tells me that it's really a pragmatism at play, isn't it? This is not a truth-seeking endeavor, as we've talked about before. It's a social engineering endeavor. Right, regardless of which, again, places it into that sort of postmodern existentialist, I think, camp, where, truth is not something that we discover. We're not really even interested in transcendent persons or principles anymore. We're really just interested in how we can affect the social and material conditions in which we live, right, in the hopes of changing ourselves. And that, one of the things that I've been thinking is a lot of people want to explore, critical race theory as an analytical tool. The same way maybe people wanted to explore classical Marxism as an analytical tool to give us some insight into the human condition. And I think there's two terms sometimes that are getting conflated. Maybe it would be best if we just make some distinctions. Compatibility versus similarity. So I've heard a lot of people say that, you know, CRT is fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. I think we'd all agree on that. The problem is, I think there are things in CRT, as there were things in Marxism, that are similar to Christianity. In fact, I mean, many after Marx called Marx the failed Christianity, the failed replacement, right, of religion. And, you know, we hear a lot of scholars, secular scholars, atheists. We've mentioned John McWhorter's name several times here. Not John MacArthur, people. John McWhorter, please look him up. Glenn Lowry, Shelby Steele, et cetera. Andrew Sullivan, who have, you know, said this is another replacement religion, right? So if there is an attempt to replace, consciously or unconsciously, it's going to have similarities to classical religions, traditional religions like Christianity. So I think the trick becomes to understand that there are similarities there, but just because there's similarities there doesn't mean you accept the thing.
Yeah,
Right?
and well,
in fact, that's how the devil would work. He would present
right. I was
you
just
something
about to say that.
Okay, right?
That's what's so insidious about it. No, exactly. That's what's so insidious is it is so similar, right? But when you look at the central tenets of it, they are incompatible and in fact antithetical to the gospel. And it's funny you mentioned that, you know, the transformation that you know, adherents of CRT will stick to, which is like, for example, that transformation occurs from the outside in rather than the inside out. If we fix this system, if we perfect this system, whether it's the criminal justice system or whether it's what have you, part of the social justice movement in different areas, if we really highlight and pinpoint these very specific scenarios, for example, you know, with the biggest one being police, a white officer, and then a black victim in these situations. If we highlight that, and if we just solely focus on that, we can perfect this to the point where we completely eliminate it from the system, and it becomes such an obsession that I think the very pursuit of it, ironically, undermines their efforts and actually harms the very people that they're trying to help. So yeah, it's kind of crazy because you're right. It's very similar. I think Marxism in general has a lot of qualities. For example, in Christianity, we want to help the oppressed. When someone is genuinely like the Good Samaritan, right, and so many other examples of that, both on a micro scale as well as a macro scale, like right with like Egypt and Israel. But yeah, it's insidious because it really and this is what you mentioned earlier, the regime that it's Jacob, the regime that it's replacing it with, we don't even know necessarily what that is. And so what I think actually is of Animal Farm, right, where the pigs, and for those of you not familiar with the story of Animal Farm, there's a bunch of these animals. It's a cute little story that George Orwell.
George Orwell wrote a lot of cute stories.
Yeah.
That's how we'd call them.
Yeah.
Cute little stories to read.
Yeah, exactly. And it's of all these farm animals, and there's these pigs in particular who basically lead this regime against the farmer, who's the oppressor in this case, and they replace him. And long story short, at the end of the book, they can't distinguish between the original farmer and the pigs who are now dressed in their clothing and basically assume their role. And so, anyways, to tie it back to what you were saying, Jake, we don't know what it's replacing with, and in fact, to the extent that we can know, it seems to be heading in a bad direction.
One thing that I'll add to that for our audience as an example, and this is connected with my dissertation, a PhD dissertation, the whole idea of human dignity. And that's what, even with this podcast, we're aiming to promote, that we're talking about equal justice and dignity of all individuals being intrinsic. So the distinction is, I think there's a huge clash between definitions, key fundamental definitions of values and principles that we held. And a major difference that you see if you look at in the past in which nations have conducted their affairs is on this idea of, like, Western civilization is grounded on the Judeo-Christian principle of dignity being intrinsic, on the fact that we all are made in the image of God. Even the founders of this nation were appealing to that very notion, whereas we don't find that fundamentally with other worldviews around the world. But as time has passed, people have adopted or accommodated the other understanding of dignity being acquired. So when we bring these definitions together and clash with each other with ideas, we are working with two different definitions. Whereas the good part, the support that we have on our side is to appeal to a history where we can actually, though we may have failed in terms of practices and action, but we can't get away from that notion of dignity being intrinsic. That is what we need to fight for, and not replace it with something. If we do replace it with something, at the end we will end up with the whole idea of which we were talking about, the whole idea of utilitarianism at the end, as to who is more effective, who is more valuable, based on the capacity and potentiality that they're able to exercise, not on the basis that they have intrinsic worth, which may be violated but not annihilated. The other definition, dignity being acquired, annihilates dignity at the end. And in doing so, that is why we cancel out people. We cancel things, right? We excommunicate people, leave them out, have no connection with them, to the point that they have no more voice, no more involvement, no more participation in the civil affair, or if we can call it civil.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump in just real quick to respond to Tony's question. And again, what Jacob was talking about, and even what Josh was talking about, this idea of can critical race theory be just an analytic lens? And when you begin, I think, addressing the actual scholars, I'm going to do two quotes real quick, so I hope it's not too much time, but when you read these scholars, they don't view themselves as doing merely analytical work, and they'll actually deny that the kind of analytical work that most of the Christian scholars, when they adopt this, are saying, they will flatly reject. So this was in response to, I think we'll probably end up doing an episode or a couple of them on Nathan, Cartagena, I guess? Cartagena's paper.
You should be able to know
paper.
Spanish with an Italian last name. That's pretty much the same.
There's a lot. I know. I'm just going to refer to my Italian heritage, I guess. Minority. I don't know. So
but
Nathan's
this is
paper.
Dr. Nathan Cartagena, who's an assistant professor at Wheaton College. This is the paper
it was his paper. I was reading through it. He quotes quite a few different individuals, tries to make the case. It's an analytic lens. We need to know what they're talking about. So I decided to buy the book that he referred to extensively. Here it is. Neil Shenvi also recommended it a long time ago. I didn't buy it when he recommended it, so I apologize for that. But right in the beginning, he quotes the foreword. So this is by Cornell West, right in the beginning. If he ends his foreword by saying this. He says, in short, critical race theory is an intellectual movement that is both particular to our postmodern and conservative times and part of a long tradition of human resistance and liberation. On the one hand, the movement highlights a creative and tension-ridden fusion of theoretical self-reflection, formal innovation, radical politics, existential evaluation, reconstructive experimentation, and vocal anguish. Like all bold attempts to reinterpret and remake the world, to reveal silenced suffering, and to relieve social misery, critical theorists put forward novel readings of a hidden past that disclose the flagrant shortcomings of a treacherous present in the light of unrealized, though not unrealizable, possibilities for human freedom and equality. He continues, critical race theory is a gasp of emancipatory hope that law can serve liberation rather than domination. Right? It's not an analytic lens. It's a worldview building, and it's used to figure out how can you use law in a particular kind of way. I don't know, in the introduction, I don't know if it's one of, Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gatanda, Gary Peller, Kendall Thomas. I don't know if it's all of these. The introduction is not signed at the end, but they say, although critical race theory, or rather critical race scholarship differs in object, argument, accent, and emphasis, it is nevertheless unified by two common interests. The first is to understand how a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of color have been created and maintained in America, and in particular to examine the relationship between that social structure and professed ideals such as the rule of law and equal protection. The second, and this is important, is a desire not merely to understand the vexed bond between law and racial power, but to change it. The essays gathered here thus share an ethical commitment to human liberation. So it's not, I mean, the idea of, oh, we're just going to take this analytical, it's not, it will continue. And then the introduction, of course, goes on to say that the idea of an objective analytic perspective does not exist outside of the parameters of power. So this, I think there's a response to try to make critical race theory work for people who don't want to buy into some of its core tenets. And I think that's the fight that's happening right now.
Well, and I think, you know, in processing very quickly the what you just cited from those from that book, just to try and reduce it down to show again that the fundamental incompatibility, the key word there being what? Liberation. Right? Well, this is an alternative means to ultimate liberation for the human person. Well, if you're a Christian, you already have an answer to how that occurs, right? It's a transcendent answer. It's the person and work of Christ. This is a immanentizing of soteriology. Just like Marx tried to immanentize eschatology, this is an immanentizing of soteriology. And what it reminds me of, Logan, is in Thomas Sowell's book, where A Conflict of Visions, when he lays out the constrained man versus the unconstrained man. And of course, he's playing off of several generations of prior philosophical thought on whether or not we are constrained by a human nature or essence, or whether or not we are unconstrained and we can literally remake or recreate ourselves.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand why people don't see through this crap, because it keeps coming up over and over again, that this is just man's attempt to be good apart from God, right? Which is the fundamental sin, the first sin, the originating sin. And also man's attempt to be God over his own kingdom that he creates. It's couched in this fancy language, fine and good. I mean, you'd like to, I want to go back in my mind to Harry Frankfurt's essay on bullshit when I hear that, because I would like to reread that essay and then apply it to, this typical kind of continental style of philosophy where you just make a lot of assertions that sound interesting and existential, but nobody knows what the hell they actually mean in praxis, right, Jacob?
This is what I would add, Tony, is as a warning for the church, or a reminder that let's take a pause before if we ever see a hint of liberation theology being resurrected back into the church, back into Christian institutions, in our chapels. If there's a hint, I think there is a need for Christians to take a pause and see where it is coming from and what is motivating, especially at this time, because we are seeing a lot of Christian institutions bringing in people intentionally to push this ideology. And definitely it does have, given the cultural circumstances, cultural mood of the time, it has its roots in pushing an agenda, which is to dismantle structure completely without replacing it with something that would honor God.
And that's a point, speaking of the impulse to tear down and totally redo, but not really say what you're going to replace, the thing you've just deconstructed, what's going to come in its place. Alistair McIntyre wrote a book, 1968 book called Marxism and Christianity, when he was still a Marxist. This was before his conversion to Roman Catholicism in 81, after he wrote After Virtue. But he makes this point. He says, both Christianity and Marxism are very good at analyzing the problem of human nature, human society and culture, right? The feeling of alienation, the need to be liberated, all that good stuff. But both fall short on the actual promise of heaven and what it's going to be like once we get there. Now, in Christianity, we do have the book of Revelation and other passages that give us a glimpse of that. But McIntyre was applying it to Marxism as well. It's kind of like, oh, we got to tear all this down because it's infected with this cancerous disease. Okay, well, once you excise the cancer, then what? We'll wait till we get there. Then we'll tell you, because we really don't know, right?
Well, this is where I was reading. I talked to you about this, Tony, a few days ago, but today before we jumped on, I was reading through On the Genealogy of Morality by Friedrich Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, that's a good point.
What's interesting, and I brought this up to you before, is I'm wondering if, it's sometimes it's hard to figure out how much of Nietzsche is just sort of just speculating, how much of it's a theory he's putting down as some sort of systematic understanding of how the world works. It's how it's written and how it's sectioned out sometimes can be hard to distinguish. But it's interesting once he starts trying to explain what he calls the slave morality. The slave revolt against the good and the bad by introducing these moral terms. He's going to peg it on to the Jewish religious custom that's then going to be inherited through Christ's act. I'm not going to, that we could have a debate about that later. But it was interesting, though, is he says that one of the fundamental aspects of the slave morality is it doesn't have a positive morality. It's all negative. It begins with finding something other. The world outside of it is bad, and you have to find something in yourself that's good, at which you're revolting against. And so you then promote values that allow you to exist. Things like he talks about humility, or things about meekness. Having a very easy kind of life becomes the raised up, and then everything that's supporting the outside system, that is evil, just inherently evil, because that's antithetical to whatever they are. And so I'm wondering if the CRT stuff, even Marx, seems to be falling in a lot to this slave morality critique that Nietzsche's thrown out there, saying because he talks about this, the birth of slave morality is going to begin is once they find an outside force in the world that's just evil, inherently evil. And then this internalized resentment to morality is what develops. Maybe they just don't have a positive view, because inherent into their moral structure is just a negative view of the world. I think Nietzsche calls it like a perpetual skepticism of the external human condition.
Well, right. And Josh, I don't know. What do you think? Is there resentment? Does one have a sense that this is a movement based on resentment?
I would say so.
Seems like it.
I'm just thinking of specific examples. Like when you say that, I'm thinking of specific examples of, it's because it's not solely just that there needs to be a retribution, right? So, or reparations is the current term really going around, in terms of monetary reparations, in terms of, apologizing for your, white guilt or ancestral guilt. That I think that's part of it. But yeah, I think a lot of the motivation that's driving the movement is born out of resentment. And I think you see that through some of the different actions, like in BLM, for example, and in different proponents, people who adhere to CRT. So yeah, it's pretty prevalent.
So Jacob, how do we cut through that? Okay, and I'll let you get that thought out, but I do want to throw this out there. How do we get to real racism then? Because I know we're doing a lot of critique of CRT, but let's just get this out there too. This is our podcast called Equal Justice. So we also want to say, okay, what are we doing to promote, to then be the alternative, something like critical race theory, in promoting actual justice for people who truly have been marginalized in the culture,
Yeah. First of all, those who are Christians and listening to us would recognize this episode in the book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar is given a vision of a colossal man made of different metals. And God is reminding him that these kingdoms have ending. They will end. New kingdom will come. And at the end, we see a rock that comes from untouched by man, hits the kingdom, and everlasting kingdom is established. But next thing that we see is King Nebuchadnezzar builds a colossal man completely made of gold. And that's the human tendency, where God says that these kingdoms are not going to last. The head was made of gold, not the whole body, when God gave the vision. But here is Nebuchadnezzar saying that I want to build a kingdom that's going to last forever. A man completely made of gold. And I think that's what we do with human kingdoms. And that's what, no matter what we try to replace it with, if we are doing it with a mindset where we question the structure without just dismantling the structure fully that has a transcendent truth, and not directing it, which it should be directed to the right end. If we do that, we are basically standing against God and saying, as you said, Tony, that we want to be like God. Our kingdom is going to last forever. And I think that's foolishness. At the end of the day, we know that that's not our hope. So that's what I just want to add to that. In terms of what we can do, this is what I would add to it. And this is what I would love to see, is that, first of all, we need to recognize that when it comes to individuals and groups, we wouldn't be able to completely dismantle or remove or discard distinctions between people and groups. We need to respect that. We need to respect the fact that God is the one who is the author of cultures. God is the author of each of us. And in terms of, he's honored in the diversity that is there among people. And we need to recognize that. Now, having said that, when diversity, when it is not glued by something together, right, as people, especially in the national context, for American context, the idea of melting pot, the idea of everyone coming together and this melting and becoming Americans, I think we need to rethink that analogy. And this is what I want to propose. If you've ever been to an Indian restaurant, go, or if not, go there, an authentic Indian restaurant, and order for something called thali. Thali is basically a big plate with small sections, small bowls on it with different varieties of dishes.
Now I'm just getting hungry. We can't go to any restaurants, though. Not in California, at least.
Nothing necessarily mixes, but they're all in this one plate. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't mix. We should sharpen each other and make each other better, share our cultural values, share our differences and everything that we have collectively in our groups or individually developed. We should do that, but there has to be this one thing that glues us together. And my understanding is that we can do that by promoting the right ideas. One of which I always say is the idea of intrinsic human worth, of intrinsic human dignity of all individuals. Because we need to recognize that over the past decades, there's been a fight against this very idea in the academia. Where we are today is not, didn't just happen randomly. It happened over time, where we actually got away from this idea that we all are created equal. You read the article by Steven Pinker, The Stupidity of Dignity, right? So what's happening at the end of the day is that there is this notion of just dissolving all differences together. And philosophically, and theologically, I see it more pantheistic in nature, that the whole idea of monism, where we are hoping that everything is going to dissolve and become one, which is not going to happen, which is not what we're seeing in Revelation. At the end of the day, every nation, every tribe, every tongue, that shows a distinction that is still maintained when we are together in the kingdom. And that distinction, so here on earth, we need to recognize and acknowledge that those differences are going to be maintained. And we need to be working towards promoting the good that is there in all groups, or among all individuals, and how we can do that while keeping that big plate together, right? Mm-hmm. You may not be able to dissolve everyone and mix everyone together. That's not going to, multiculturalism in one sense has failed for this reason, that there was no one glue. And in my opinion, the gospel ideas, the ideas like intrinsic dignity of individuals, the ideas like the foundations of love, or love as the foundation of our engagement with each other, that we all are fallen. We all are. It's not just the other who is oppressing me who is fallen. The one who is oppressed also needs the same kind of salvation that we are longing for. These are some of the ideas we need to be pushing in our culture, in academia, in church, in other places. And I think when we do that, we will initiate a process. Now, this is one thing we need to recognize. The culture in which we are right now, as you mentioned already, we have adopted this idea somehow, consciously or unconsciously, that end justifies the means. And that's a dangerous idea. we need to recognize as Christians, particularly, that the process is as important as the end, right? We have to have that good balance of promoting goodness, truth, and beauty, even in our process, if we are hoping for goodness, truth, and beauty at the end. And if that's not happening, then we are basically distancing ourselves from promoting human flourishing at the end of the day.
Now, Jacob, wouldn't the average social justice warrior, to put it that way, wouldn't they say, but look, we are celebrating diversity, right? We're the ones who are pointing out all of these types of people who have been unloved over the years. Homosexuals, lesbians, racial minorities. They've been unloved. And, let's use the more substantive word than marginalized. They've been unloved. We're the ones pointing out that these people need to be loved better, right? Loved more correctly. So, so there does seem to be like something about pointing out that celebrating diversity, right? That's the thing. As what you're saying, though, but that at the end of the day, what we don't know is what would unify that diversity. And this is where there's an attempt to try and find something that might unify all of these cultural and even personal diversities, these things. But we don't know what it is.
The whole idea of e pluribus unum, where do we get that from? The whole idea of university, where do we get that from? The whole idea, these are some of the values that we have always held throughout history and maintained. That's something we need to be fighting for. So right now we can all talk about diversity, maintaining diversity, but at the expense of unity, that which unifies us, gonna divide us even more. And one thing that I would say is that social justice warriors, or whoever it may be, who are saying that we are the ones, the champions of the oppressed, let me ask them to take a pause and look at human history, evaluate what Christianity has done around the world, how Christianity has even contributed to a place where we can actually be together, regardless of our differences, and value each other. An analysis of human history would make it very clear, even to an atheist. If you, Tom Holland, if you read his book.
I was thinking exactly of what he said before.
Just read his book.
Black Lives Matter doesn't even get off the ground in a non-Christian context.
Exactly. And so I would say just have a look and determine for yourself as to, are you the only lone voice fighting for these causes in this culture? You are not. And this is what I tell people who adopt critical race theory without questioning is that there are different aspects to it that we do understand that, yes, it does connect with our Christian values. It does promote certain Christian values. The whole idea of understanding who the oppressor is, who is the oppressed, it's a good value. But let me ask you, why is it that we need to be adopting critical race theory to basically promote those ideas and values, or hold those values and ideas? Christianity has always offered that. Christ has always offered that. And we have fought for millennia for those issues, those concerns that we've had.
Well, go ahead, Josh.
Well, okay, I'll be quick with my point, but just to piggyback off of what you guys were saying, the question, right, is what is it that creates unity, and what is CRT's answer for that? I would say CRT's answer is reformation of systems, and specifically of systems that oppress the victim. And if we just replace the oppressor and we change that, if we can somehow minimize the damage that they do to the victim in that oppressor-oppressee relationship, that's salvation in the CRT model. But as Christians, I think we have the answer to that. I don't think you can have unity without truth. And that's the problem of postmodernism is when you have different there's nothing. What is there to unify over if you don't have a common ground in reality? If there is no real way that things are, and so that's where I think biblical the person of Christ in the Bible really comes to play, where it says full of grace and truth. He is our salvation. Jesus is our answer to. He is what unifies us as brothers and sisters in Christ. And so that's what we have to offer as Christians, is we can say Jesus is the great unifier. He unifies us with the Father through the Holy Spirit. And so that is our source of salvation. But for CRT, I would say that just seems to be changing the system in which the oppressor can no longer be oppressed, and how to go about that, the methodology, or what's considered good for the victim, that's in the air, because there is no grounding objective morality, at least under most forms of CRT that I've been introduced to. It seems pretty rampant with postmodernism. So again, just to summarize, I think at the end of the day, in order to have unity, you do need truth.
Well, Logan, that brings up a good point. Who knows what's best for the victim?
Yeah.
That's another question, right? Who knows? Who's the one to say, I know what's best for the oppressed group? Here it is.
Yeah, well, when you're looking at for a lone voice, I think their ready-made answer is going to be something like, the victim knows what's best for the victim. And this is where you get this bizarre sort of ethnic Gnosticism, as I think Bodhi Bakum would call it. But viewpoint epistemology, I think, like, not necessarily just, one-to-one correspondence between those two theories, but the idea that the individual has kind of the all-seeing eye on their own situation, and no one else could conceivably understand that. It becomes difficult, as you said, when you have a group of people. Who's the group's eye? You can get to questions about Rousseau's will the people, and these sorts of things, which end up just totally falling apart, because then you do have to say, okay, who's the one that's going to act on behalf of the people? Right. And then you just once you open that up, I am now the voice of the people. That has never ever ended well. But I wanted to get back to Jacob's comment, and it's and maybe this is just a conversation to have about sort of the historical situation of Christian philosophy. But I think a lot of people would argue that the reason why they adopt critical race theory, or because they think critical race theory is valuable, is because they don't think within the Christian maybe recent tradition. Obviously in the historical tradition, it's been a big case, but questions about justice and social views on how people should interact. They'll say, well, our United States, as I read from the quotes from the critical race theory book, right? America has, through its laws, created a white supremacist system and has kept it alive and well, maybe out of direct view, but it's there, and we need to figure out critical race theory, figure out how to change that. And questions about how does Christianity do this, questions about Christian social value, how to do this, has not been, I think, at the forefront of Christian, at least philosophical analysis at the popular level. For I think the recent, and this might just because my background in analytic Christian philosophy, the recent fight was over, the work in Plantinga and stuff like that, where they're trying to get off are there like rational Christian, like rational religious beliefs? Is that even like a possibility to have a conversation about? So they had a very different project, which I think was necessary, because now, but they're responding to, again, the logical positivists and saying that there are things outside of the material world that can have truth value. So they're responding to something else, and maybe throwing all those resources won one battle, but now introduce a new one. But I think that would be to answer Jacob's question. I think that's the shift they think is valuable. Now I think the question though is, okay, but practically it's super destructive. And that's why I wanted to ask Tony, do we want to begin going over your 6 things now? Do we want to use that at a different time?
I do want to do that. And let me address something you just said about planning as work, and where, planning in the 70s, 80s, and 90s is trying to answer challenges from scientism, logical positivism, and later on Dawkins. And, we talked about this yesterday, Logan, this idea of Francis Schaeffer's, right? Where the church and theology especially is always lagging behind the philosophy of the day. The philosophy of the day, we think right now, is critical race theory, although when you listen to certain scholars, black scholars, like McWhorter and Lowry, a lot of this stuff has been sort of evaluated and found wanting like 30 years ago. But now, I mean, in McWhorter's, one of McWhorter's part of his analysis is the only reason you're sort of seeing this second sort of generation of critical race theory is because of social media and a handful of popular level authors and professors who just sort of trying to update what was done in the 80s. But a lot of this stuff has been adjudicated and found wanting 40 years ago. But for the church, it's brand new. And like, oh my goodness, this is, we got to react to this. And it's like, it's already been reacted to. It's already been sort of, left behind. But for us, it's like a big new thing. The same way we still have maybe people trying to respond to the logical positivists, although I think that they have been now fairly thoroughly responded to. But yeah.
Let me ask this question then, Tony, because this is the kind of question I've been going back with a few friends on social media. It's also been questions I've been going, over the phone or even in person. What is it about the church now? This might be speculative. This might be direct human experience for each one of us. What is it about the church now that makes them wanting to jump on CRT versus when it was coming out and was the right new thing on the block? And, you have, I'm reading through Hayek's The Social Mirage, the Mirage Social Justice, sorry. And this is, again, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that they're like, there's just nothing here.
Well,
why? What do we like? We're using words. We have no idea what they mean. He even says like the idea of social in front of justice, like the idea of social institution, social structure has no referent. What are you talking about? There's nothing there. Right. So it's like, it was like obliterated by some of these top academics. Didn't really take hold in the church. Now it's like, if you're not on board with critical race theory, then what are you doing?
Well, I think McWhorter is, of course, in part right that people just know about it now. Back in the 80s, he's saying, these things would get published in certain kinds of magazines that a handful of people would read, and it was just hashed out amongst the Illuminati in the academy. Now it's like, we're talking, like us four are talking about it, right? So, and Phil Vischer and everybody else who we mentioned in the past, who's just really, it looks, I'm sorry, Phil Vischer. He's made so many good things for the church. But it's just, partly it's just that, right? It's just took about 40 years and now we have the technology so that people can talk about it. I think the other thing though, and McWhorter also brings this up in his interview with Jason Riley from, I believe, December 16. Pressure, political pressure, social pressure. Yeah. If you don't, somebody's going to not like you, and they're going to call you names. Mm-hmm. So, or even we're the church.
We're going further beyond that. I mean,
or you might lose you can't.
Yeah, you might lose your job. You can get kicked off a plane. Also, cancel culture is going pretty far now.
Okay, so leading up into the 6 points, and this I do want to make something. I was reading again Erich Fromm's book, who was the father of modern sociology. I mean, there's no critical race theory if you don't have guys like Erich Fromm. If Erich Fromm never existed, or Max Weber, or guys like this, even though I don't know that half of the people who want to embrace critical race theory ever, know of who Erich Fromm and Max Weber and Herbert Marcuse and these guys were. But Josh is right. I mean, you have a lot of people who want to embrace this who are in the secular academy. Okay. Their jobs are on the line if they go against the grain. Okay. Now with the old school modernist, you might have been considered weird by the biologist, the evolutionary biologist. You might have be considered strange by the atheist philosopher if you were a Christian theologian, philosopher, whatever, at the secular 20 years ago. But now you're considered
an outcast,
wicked. Now, like Logan, you made the point. Now there's the moral normativity comes in, right? You're not just weird or strange because you believe in these metaphysical realities like God and angels and demons and human souls. Now, if you hold to that traditional Christian worldview, you're evil, you're wicked. It's time to get rid of you. right? So I think a lot of guys and gals just say, who have felt accepted in the academy, because they're probably very smart and that's where they find their social comfort, are willing to ditch their prior ecclesial commitments, to put it lightly.
Yeah.
The ecclesial commitments become less important because they have gained acceptance in the academy. Now that's an old narrative. We can go back to, the sermons of the early 20th century about the cultured despisers, why Billy Graham said, I don't want to go to university, I just want to go preach the gospel, and other guys like that, and how evangelicals have been trying to find that balancing point. But you got a theory out there now that's really going to put your ecclesial commitments, your commitments to God's church, on the line, and your own position in the academy. And I think that's where it's just difficult for people. They don't have necessarily, to put it lightly, the guts to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I think what makes it so, I don't know,
And
interesting.
What's problematic is, and I'm sorry, I'll go off in here. This is similar to having sort of then an elite class. You get sort of a classism in the church, right? Logan, you've talked about this. Part of what we're trying to do is, how do we connect the academy to the church, right? This is what we're so hopeful for. But you get an elitism in the academy of Christian philosophers, theologians, whatever, and they're going to pronounce moral judgments. They're going to lob grenades from on high to the aharitz, the folk Christians, the people who were in the National Mall on January 6th, the big dummies. And they're going to lob their grenades. Those are just the folksy Christians, right? So now you have a classism, not unlike the Sadducees and the Pharisees who lived in Jerusalem, the cultured elite, and the people of the land, who were maybe more willing to sort of be pissed off at the Romans, for lack of a better word, because they weren't so in bed
living through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think, because I think the question, though, that becomes important then is at what point is there disagreement, right? Because you talked about putting ecclesial commitments on the line. The question then is, okay, what has CRT done, or what does CRT provide that fundamentally clashes with ecclesial commitments? Like, if it's just a methodological lens, right? And this is why I read the quotes directly from Cornel West and from the introduction from the sort of conglomerate of editors, is that it seems to be worldview building. It provides an alternative understanding of how law works. I mean, the Old Testament has a very direct and clear understanding of how law is to function. And then it says, okay, well, it's going to be in the service of some certain kinds of outcomes of what we think is human nature through sort of existential reflection. All of these points are now competing for like the Christian narrative. And I think this is where I'll get a conversation with people is, I think it's very telling when you ask them, do you believe people are fundamentally equal? And there's a hesitancy to say yes from the CRT side, not because they want to say they're racist or because but they understand that there's a part of CRT which says certain things should be distributed according to other things than just fundamental human nature, right? We're equal because we all have certain economic relations, or we all have certain, not merit, but we have certain things that were given to us that should not have been given to us, right? The idea of chance, the human condition, being born. I mean, all these things start turning into questions about how are things distributed? How do we treat people unequally because it's just and it's right?
And I think one of the things we should add to our discussion is that our listeners would hear us, that when we say these things, this is not that we don't question the evil that might be there, that certain people would do, right? There might be a need for us to rethink our system and improve it without dismantling it. It's not denial of racism anywhere. Racism does exist, and it's a sin that we need to be fighting, and fighting well. So the problem is with CRT, as you said, dismantling the whole system that has produced much good, not just in the Western world, but around the world, though it had its own weaknesses. And that's what we are called to fight for today, or fight against.
Yeah, well, take the term racism, right? I mean, I think there are really two competing definitions of racism. D'Angelo will bring this up. I think Michelle Alexander will bring this up in her book, The New Jim Crow. And you have kind of like the classical, traditional definition of racism, which is the intention of one person's intention to treat someone else differently based upon their race, right? As consequences, there's an intention there, there's consequences, right? The newer definition, though, isn't so much pegged to the individual as it's sort of pegged to out there, right? There are social institutions, of which they're not named. There are people, which are more so being named as symptoms, again, of an underlying system. But the system's never exposed. It's just out there in the world. There's this web of social features that's oppressing. And that's what racism truly is. It's not the individuals, because they're products of their environment, right, of these environmental forces. And so you have now compete, and again, this goes back to what I was talking about, Tony. It seems like there's competition of these ecclesial commitments. When Paul is writing letters to the churches, he's not saying, I know that out there in the world, there's these laws that are making you hate your neighbor. Right? These sort of, these objects just, they don't appear to exist. Now, he does talk about, principalities and powers and so on and so forth, of which they're fighting against, but the moral impetus is on the individual to live out God's will through the help of the Holy Spirit. So it's a very what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is that there's two very different views of racism, and they're not compatible.
And that brings up the whole point about how we are morally transformed, or how we are transformed into better or more moral creatures. Like, is it through our interaction with the Holy Spirit, with an actual the God of the universe, or is it through going out and changing institutions? I mean,
there's a reason.
It could be a little bit of both, I suppose. But if you're going to say one to the expense of the other, or if I would at least want to say, to err on the side of the caution, that I hope your emphasis is first on how to be changed through your personal and corporate relationship with Jesus Christ, as opposed to going out there and being a political activist to change the social material conditions around you in the hopes that that will make you a better person.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, what becomes difficult though is like, so when you say changing institution or changing the individual, I mean, what do you mean by when you say you need to change an institution? You're like, oh, we'll create different laws. Well, that's the entire argument of the new Jim Crow, is that we could create laws that we believe are injustice, but the impact is just racist. So the question is, even if you change institutions, what I think at least CRT has to at least admit is that at the end of the day, those forces can be changed by the individuals which man them. Nietzsche goes over that. I mean, it's just like a broad understanding that if the origin of a law does not necessarily correlate to how it's functioned and how it's issued out, and it without being guided by an individual. And this is why like if you just like research like the history of why judges are the way they are and the persona that they have, and this idea that they even would wear robes and so on and so forth. There's like a history that you could have all the right laws, but you bring the wrong person in, all those laws are now in place to kind of enact whatever abuse the individual who takes the throne does. So it comes down again to, if you just change, say if you're successful in changing all the institutions, but you didn't change a single person, you're going to be in the exact same place, which is what, Michelle Alexander is getting at with. Now, I'm going to disagree. I don't know if like the war on drugs was inherently designed to go after the Black community. I don't know if that's clear. I don't know enough on that. But if we just allow that, we could pass laws on just prosecuting drugs, if put in the wrong hands, are just as bad as maybe good laws about drug laws that we could have. I don't know. You end up getting back to the individual, I think, if you pursue that line of reasoning all the way to its end.
I think people are passionate about these things because they, and you're right, Logan, they have seen the outworking of evil hearts, right? It's not the outworking of evil laws. You can be racist in the presence of just laws.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Exactly.
and much of what we have today is just law, and over 90%, I would say, is drawn out of, if we see the law of the land here in the Western world, is drawn out of the scriptures. So I would ask a person who is adopting CRT, what are some of the laws that you want to change, right? And what's the motivation behind that? Is it a moral issue, or is it an issue of structure? Is it an issue of, or something else, right? And work with that. But whereas when we are not talking about, if we are talking about replacing the whole system and subverting it, that's questionable. But yeah, this fact of that we need to be seeing the, again, I'm saying the same thing, which is being questioned now, which is a fact that the evil rests in our heart. Sin is in us. We are the ones who could be racist in the presence of just law. And that's what a Christian, that's what gospel is. God gives us a law to keep it, and we don't keep it. Therefore, Jesus.
Well, and Black scholars are the ones that we continue to mention, and Jason Riley's another one that we haven't mentioned as much. Coleman Hughes, I think they, I've heard them in various ways point out this idea of, none of critical race theory is actually going to lead to a future solution for those Black communities that continue to hurt and struggle with poverty and bad schooling and stuff. There's already a rejection that this is going to lead to any future good. And, it also, and this is where I would really tried to warn, again, white heterosexual males who are evangelicals who want to embrace this. Are we really treating Black people as people on this theory? Or are we treating them as like helpless children? Because Logan mentioned the victim epistemology. Now, I haven't read a lot on this, but I mean, would we take a woman, would we take a 12-year-old girl who's been sexually abused her whole life and say that she's got the right idea about sexuality? I don't know. Would we just take victims and say that they have some kind of special knowledge that we don't have? They have experiences, but the experiences are distorted. I mean, would I say as a victim of sin that I know what to do about sin, or do I have to go to Revelation? Well, in the Bible and the person of Christ to find out what I should do with that, because obviously as a victim of sin and my own will and external forces, my understanding is distorted. It seems to me that that you might be able to you want to understand the victim better. You want to understand their experiences, but that doesn't mean that they have the answers.
So yeah, it doesn't mean they're the authority on the answer to their problem. Yeah. I mean, I think as Christians, that's what we need to hold to, is that we often don't. We need that's one of the biggest reasons why we need Jesus. He and for many reasons, but he's the source. God is the source of all authority. And so I think when it comes to especially problems of sin, moral issues, right, within our own character development, within the sanctification process, your source of salvation or your source of authority has to be placed in something transcendent as a Christian. That's what we believe in. It can't come from ourselves. And like you said earlier, Tony, like that was like the first great sin, is that, we look inward to say, oh, I'm God. I'm the solution. I'm the answer to my own problems. I know what's best for me. And that's just a lie. That's just not true. Now in certain circumstances, right, like there's an element of truth to it. We can come up, we're savvy, right? We can come up with, these temporary solutions to our everyday issues. We're like, oh, okay, my stomach's hurting. All right, I'm going to go get a pill at, some Tums or something to go fix that. Like, I don't need to go in prayer for that, or I don't need God for that. And I think but that's the insidious part of it, is you go little by little. I don't need God for this. I don't need God for this. I can construct this whole life for myself outside of God. That's the Tower of Babel. That's the great sin. And so I think that is exactly why CRT is so dangerous, because it places the authority and for those answers within the person of the victim. They're the one who has epistemic access to what it's even like to, what the problem even is, what it's even like to be in that condition, let alone the solution, like reparations or what have you. Oh, and I'll give you a perfect example of this. In the Black community, there's a lot of talk about reparations for different sins, and we can get. I mean, there's a whole lot of premises you have to question there. Like, are you even the personal victim of it versus your ancestors and other things like that? But even assuming that a specific community is the victim of a specific sin, the question is, how do you go about resolving that conflict or addressing that wound? And that's very important. It's not even just because we don't want to be dismissive. And this is going back to what you were saying, Jacob. We're not dismissing that there is real racism. There is real examples of oppression in reality. But what we're saying is that the source of hope for those real issues lies outside the doesn't lie within any one person, but lies within the transcendent. It lies within Jesus Christ himself. And as a Christian, I think we have to hold to that.
Yeah, and we should be very careful as Christians that we don't completely discard or discount lived experiences of people. People do have those, and we all do, right? Mm-hmm. We all engage in meaning-making process, but not necessarily truth-making process. Truth stands regardless of, and my own experiences does not define truth. Truth must inform my experiences. And that shift has to happen in our culture as well. So a group of people can create their own experiences, and the other group would have different experiences. What they should be doing is that they should, in the midst of that, ask, does my understanding of our lived experiences conform to the biblical understanding of what it should be? And I think when we have that as a center point, a point to aim at and bring these experiences together, right? That's the only solution. And that's where reconciliation happened. That's where forgiveness happened. And that's where gospel takes its root. Yeah. And I think I personally, as someone who comes from a different culture, there can be a lot of things I can listen to and question, and a lot of a reaction that I can have. But there's one thing I can say. The process in which we were on, that was bringing about, that's been questioning the evil in our culture, in our society. As we were progressing, what we have done with critical race theory and critical theory is that we have, in my analysis, in my understanding, it's an attempt to take us back to a place where we all started, in terms of dividing people on the basis of the color of their skin, on the basis of their experiences, whereas not offering as to what is it that that should bring all of us together, right? And I personally believe, as a Christian, as someone who believes in it truly, and gospel is the only solution, right? Gospel is the only standard by which we can bring these experiences, different experiences, yes, and sometimes not so good experiences, but conform it to the standard that gospel offers. And if we are able to remove that, if we remove gospel out of the picture and trust on our lived experiences as the source of truth, it's only going to divide us even more.
Let me continue that thought, because, some people who watch this podcast are going to see, especially Josh, Logan, and I, Well, you guys are just, I mean, and this is going to come because, again, I think this is more of as much a psychological mechanism as it is an actual academic theory. But it's going to come that, well, you guys are just angry white guys who want to continue to exert dominance over people who maybe look more like Jacob. And of course, I think all of us are at the point where we'll just ignore that, but I think Jacob's right. This is a tool for division. It's something that will only divide at the end. And unlike those who might challenge me on this and say that I just want to exert dominance, my one great I don't know if I want to say fear, but fear about critical race theory has been from the beginning that it has the potential to end real friendships between people, to include spousal relationships, potentially. That's it. That's ultimately, when I get down to the bottom of it, it really, really bothers me that people who otherwise are good friends, close friends, potentially even a man and a woman who just happen to be different races, if you want to use the term races, but one's black, one's white, one's Mexican, one's white, whatever, that their relationship will end because of this. And I think that's evil. I think that's evil. So we wanted to get to these 6 points, Logan. Maybe this would be the time, because these are in part rhetorical. They're meant to be rhetorical. We're not actually advocating this, right? But seems to me that one could make a case for any of these 6 points if you really wanted to give yourself over to critical race theory and put it into action. So I don't know if you guys, yeah.
I'll just add to this and to our listeners, whoever it may be. And this is not, you talk about friendship, and this friendship is not being affected only between people of races.
Right.
I can share this.
Not across racial lines. It's true.
Here, standing for and fighting for the truth, we have lost friends who have started keeping distance from us, right? So it's not about color particularly, right? It's about ideas. Mm-hmm. And I think at the end of the day, as Christians, we should be, and this is where I find my solace, and something that I learned from a good friend of mine. There comes a time for a Christian to ask, what I'm offering, is it to maintain my friendship, or do I care for my friend? A distinction between friendship and friend. The ideal would be to have both. But in the realms of ideas, in the realms of where ideas clash, a Christian is brought to a place where he or she will have to ask, do I value my friendship more than my friend? Or do I value my friend more than my friendship?
And that's a question every parent has to ask with regards to their child as well.
Well, and this is, I think I really liked what you brought up, Tony, about this idea of, and this goes again with Jacob, like why friendships are ending on this. I mean, yes, in my life, I've had several friendships end on issues very related to this. And we have to ask the question, what is victim mentality doing? It's not, I mean, we could have, right, the conflict at the theoretical level. Part of the theoretical conflict, I think, is to say it's not just a theory. CRT is not just theory. CRT scholars don't view what they're doing just as theory. They're very explicit. And maybe in some of our further podcasts, we can take a little deeper dive into some of these CRT scholars. But what ends up happening is you have to ask, what is the value? This is more of a Nietzsche way of saying, what is the value of the morals of victimhood? Now, the reason why I'm referring to Nietzsche on this is so that at least the audience knows this. I'm not just reading Christian scholars who support our view. Nietzsche is not a friend of Christianity by any stretch of the imagination. He's very anti-Christian and from the ground up. But he has an insight where he says, okay, but we need to be able to at least look at certain moral values and ask, but what do they do for the person, right? And when you look at things like victim mentality, right? I have never read a book on psychology. If it's Freud, if it's Horney, if it's, any of these other, modern, psychologists you kind of pick up as you're waiting in a doctor's office or something, that say, you know what, the one way you need to change your life and become a better person, just blame everyone else for your problems. Or at least realize that all of your faults are someone else's burden. No one has ever said that. And actually, I read his name escapes my mind. It's somewhere in here in this book. There's like Extreme Responsibility or something. It was by a Navy SEAL. I don't remember.
Oh, I know what the book you're talking about. Extreme Ownership or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Extreme Ownership.
Yeah.
It was interesting because he even makes the arguments like, just take responsibility even if it's not your fault. You'll tend to do better in the long run. But what's interesting is because he's looking at what does it do for an individual in their like human growth or whatever, like, like as a person, being able to take on responsibility and accountability and so on and so forth. And it becomes more of a like friendship infuriating kind of thing where I have to ask questions. Like I had a debate with a friend about affirmative action. And I was like, the problem I have with affirmative action is that it's hard to convince myself to adopt it personally. Like I don't see how I would look at an individual and say, I'm going to value you, give you preferences, like treat you better or treat you less of a person depending upon your race. I just don't see that being fair. I wouldn't want someone to be, oh, you're white here, I'm going to treat you better. It kind of robs me of, no, I've actually done things that's valuable, I think, and I would like to be responded to on those standards. I have a problem trying to do that to my friends, and there's a fight, we need you to not your friends and people you don't know. And so it becomes, again, at this very fundamental level of human existence and living out your life, you run into these problems where you're like, I can't accept treating my friends differently just because of race. I'm not going to, sorry, Jacob, I'm not going to treat you any better than Tony because of the color of your skin. Like, that's just what? As Christians, we're not called to do that.
Yeah.
Explicitly, Paul, I think Paul, like every other problem was based on, don't treat the rich with preference. Don't treat the Jews with preference. Dine with the Gentiles just as much as you are with the Jews, Peter, like kind of thing. I don't know.
No, that's good. That's good. Well, the alternative that I thought, if one were to go to the critical race theory route, and say, well, I think these folks have it right. There needs to be these fundamental changes to the system. The question is, and I'm sort of speaking to maybe the white heterosexual male evangelical Christian who finds himself in the privileged position, because he is, and really wants to put into practice anti-racism, to use maybe Kendi's term, because he wants to see the real societal change that's being called for in the streets. Okay, so like what would we expect that person to actually do if you were going to say, and let this, as Francis of Assisi once said, and let it begin with me, right? Let the revolution begin with me. So I'm a white heterosexual male evangelical Christian. Let the critical race theory revolution begin with me. And I think you could make a case that these are 6 things that somebody should do if they are that person who wants to advocate for critical race theory. The first one is, if you are a white heterosexual Christian,
qualify that these are not the things that we are suggesting.
No, we don't actually.
Natural.
That's right. I thought I said that. We don't actually believe these unless we were fully committed to the theory, I think. And then we did say something like, and let this theory begin with me. Let me be the one to first put it into practice, right?
We don't want anyone to cut this section and then post it saying that this is what we are advocating.
Right. So not
These
to
are the natural
again,
implications
but
of CRT. Exactly.
so let's. I'm just again. So we're just speculating, right? What would it be like if somebody really took this stuff seriously? And the first thing I came up with, guys, was if you are a white heterosexual male evangelical Christian, and you're in a position of leadership. You are a university president or a seminary president, CEO of a business, pick the institution you're over. You should, because it's possible, if not likely, that the only reason you are that president of that university or company is because you're a white heterosexual male. So if you want critical theory to begin with you, you need to quit your job immediately. And you need to find the next in the chain of command there, in whatever institute, you need to find the next person of color and implement them in as to take over your position. You need to find the next brown or black body and make them the new president, or, at least get everybody else on board to make them the new president or of the institution that you run. And then you need to go find some other job.
What if someone would question, based on D'Angelo's recommendation, that they are keeping their privileged position in these institutions because they are bringing about policies and action supporting CRT from their privileged position? Can they do that?
Well, that is D'Angelo's defense, and most of these people's defense. Well, I'm going to use my privilege for good.
But for good, yeah.
They're using the Ring of Sauron. We'll do it right this time.
How can they do that when they don't have the knowledge that they are not the race that they are not part of? How can they bring about any change?
Well, they're hoping to change. This is D'Angelo again, just to be clear. I don't, we can talk. I don't know the other scholars. I'm not entirely sure their nuance. D'Angelo is going to say, well, she's helping white people specifically. She's not so much interested in trying to reform the black community or brown community or any other community, except she says, I want to use my white privilege to help other white people see that they're privileged and should not live like that.
And here's one way, circular, and here's one way you can empower somebody: give them your job.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what D'Angelo, honestly, that's
here's
the old do as I say, don't do as I do. I mean, we heard that in the military all the time, right?
Yeah.
Do as I say, don't do as I do, because I'm exempt. I'm just exempting myself.
Yeah.
That's just crap. So.
Well, it seems like, because the argument would be like, okay, so it's almost like white privilege has to exist for D'Angelo to make sense, right? Because the only reason she has a voice that's important, according to her view, is because of white privilege. What if she gave up white privilege for some privilege someone else, and she wouldn't have the authority to speak on the issues to help other white people? So it's this weird, like, whatever you do, it's not going to work out unless you just kind of ad hoc justify it. Oh, I'm bringing it up to help.
Somewhere, I'm speculative. I don't know the woman, but somewhere in her thinking, she realized she just got herself into a trap and she needed a cop out. She realized I need a way out of this.
And could it be that this is a motivation for? Could it be that this is a motivation for people in educational institution, and even in churches, to basically push this idea through because they want to keep their jobs? And they're arguing that, I want to keep my job, I want to keep my position, but see, I'm making changes.
We give people in some ways too much credit, don't we? Like, they're pure moral agents. Come on. People are people. They're trying to just keep their jobs at the end of the day.
Yeah. Also, but here's also what I guess one legitimate response I would think maybe is that, and this is just something I found, I found when I was studying through philosophy in undergrad and graduate level, it was always like these one-liners in a book I was reading the theory. I'm like, wow, that was like a really insightful piece. And it was Aristotle. He was like critiquing other moral theories. And he was just like, just look at the guy living that life and say, do I want to live like that? And if your answer is no, then his moral theory is probably not going to be helpful. Like, he just like is very grounded in human experience. I thought that was super insightful. I think what has happened to like the ethics departments, I was talking to Moreland about this. He laughed it off. It's not like off as far as not important. He just laughed like, yeah, that's probably closer to the truth than most are recognizing. I think ethics has turned into less about that. Like, let's find a moral theory that helps people, and instead let's find a moral theory that lets me do what I want and feel like justified in doing it.
Yep.
Because we're no longer testing moral theories like we used to. It was like, wow, you're telling, and this might go back to maybe this is why we're so experience oriented now. Is if you don't experience, you have nothing to say. Is because we'll say things like, oh, here's how you help someone who's dealing with depression. But then you ask, okay, but has it actually helped anybody?
Yeah.
Right? They're like, well, I don't know.
Have you actualized it?
Have you helped anyone?
You could actualize Robin DiAngelo's theory if you're a university president and you actually give your position over to the next person of color beneath you, because now they're the president. They get the benefits of being the president. The president.
You could actually help someone according to your theory. Yeah.
The president's decision-making power. There you go.
Would Biden let Kamala Harris reverse the position?
There you go, Joe Biden.
Well, that's coming anyways.
Biden shouldn't be impeached. He should just resign.
That's coming anyway.
That might happen. So don't wish for that one. That one might actually happen. He's going out anyways. Make it most politically aligned.
Here's a second way that the white heterosexual male who embraces critical race theory could actualize the theory. Start your own personal project of reparations. Make programmatically. Don't wait for the government to give reparations. You go and start giving reparations to Black people. You can do the research until the point where you are I would say, at a point of financial instability yourself. That might be
especially since the financial stability that you have is due to your privilege and not because you earned it.
Yeah, that's across the board. That's the
and we are not saying that you start a trust or a non-profit where you get tax exemption. That's not what we're talking about, right?
Collect donations and then donate other people's money. Donate your own. No. You're the one who's contributed to the problem, so you have to contribute to the solution. I think they would get on board with that, right?
Yeah.
At least that line of
Well, I forgot, they had like a day where on Venmo, they Venmoed like 50, like they said, like Venmo $50 to your Black friend. There was an actual thing and people actually did it. So it's not, some of the stuff
symbolic. We don't want symbolism. We want real activism. You got to get yourself into a position of where you are on the brink of financial collapse. Otherwise it doesn't count. And what I'm trying to highlight here, guys, and I think we all agree, let's go this route. What you will see is the end of grace. This is going to be a graceless thing, man, if we accept it. Because
it's all, it's you owe the person. Yeah, there's no.
Yeah, it's not about grace.
No, that you oppress them.
Yeah,
or you contributed to a system of oppression, more specifically. And you owe money and thankfulness. I mean, once thankfulness is gone, there's not a lot of hope for society.
Mm.
The third one's even tougher, and it is the thing that scares me because I've seen.
Keep upping it, Tony.
Well, because I've seen people writing about this, not in the scholarly way, but at the popular level, that people who are in biracial marriages should end their marriages. I've seen articles on this because the white person in the marriage, be it the woman, the wife or the husband, are implicitly in a dynamic of oppressor oppressed. Yeah. Why not end the marriage then? Why be in that position? You should get divorced.
Well, if you use your privilege, then you could help your spouse, right? Is that the defense? You're kind of carrying them on your back.
How do you know when you are at the point of sort of being enlightened or not? I mean, at least get divorced for a while or separate for a while, because until you are fully enlightened about critical, you may be implicitly oppressing your spouse.
Yeah. Well, that's what the implicit bias. Yeah, the whole
argument just because you're white, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think this is a good part to have that conversation where you have, and I know that the CRT defense is the only scholarly defense. We never said that. I mean,
sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm reading through these books. There's not a lot of here's what you need to do. They're very clear. I mean, Michelle Alexander, I don't know how to solve this problem. I'm just going to elucidate the problem. Yeah, Biangio does the same thing. A lot of these critical theorists. Here's the problem. They don't really point to a solution, but I think what you have to ask though is, okay, but if you're saying certain things, what is the natural consequence? When you say society's divided up into two segments, the oppressed or the oppressor, here's where all the oppressed are, here's where all the oppressors at. Why does it not apply to marriage? Like what, I mean, I think maybe that's the pushback you give CRT scholars is, okay, what in your theory would say, we actually don't say get a divorce? Well, okay, where in your theory would it say that? Right? And it might be, kind of prove your own innocence situation, but you have to look at the practical implications when you say all of society is this and that. Why does families not exist in all of society?
Something that I'll add to this, maybe not directly connected, but a question that people here in the West should be asking. And this could be a topic for someone who wants to do a dissertation on this. Let's ask the outcome of CRT also in terms of biracial children. What is it that we are offering them? A case study that someone can do is people called Anglo-Indians in India. And when the British came, they had children with Indian, they had one of the parents, Indian parents, and a white British parent. And you just have to study the plight of Anglo-Indians as to how they find it difficult to be accepted within the Indian culture, at the same time being accepted by the British, and how they are trying to live out their life in between cultures. And I'm not saying that that's not doable, it's not beautiful or anything valuable. They are. But in terms of their appeal to privileges in the society, the tension that is there, if we are not playing on the equal ground in terms of understanding the equal worth of all individuals regarding of what race you are in, we can actually create a subsect as parents who are biracial and having children, as to how does then CRT informs that. We should be asking that very question as well, which I don't think anyone is asking that question as to what kind of outcome CRT would have for a child who is left with no choice, right, for future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it almost seems like the natural outcome of that under CRT would be to adore and idolize one parent and to resent and the other.
I mean, this
whoever the oppressor is and whoever the victim is,
This is happening though, Josh. I think this is actually happening. I guarantee you it's happening in families where you have a biracial family and the children and kids are starting to think bad about the white parent because that's what they're being told, right? At the popular level, at the street level, right? The street level, that's what's happening.
I'll give you a case, hypothetical here. A black father and a white mother, and the child looks white, right? And the child goes out, who's been raised in a family that honors all races and all cultures and everything, is raised biblically and to respect all, but goes out and is accused of being racist because the child looks white. Think about that. All because the person looks white, but is born and raised in a biracial family, is accused when he goes out of being racist, all because this person looks white. These are some of the consequences or outcomes of questioning an individual, not on the basis of their character, but on the basis of their skin color.
Yeah. Well,
so,
I think,
let me play devil's advocate real quick, just for some of the listeners. What if instead we say, okay, I get what you're saying. Maybe there's some extreme forms of CRT, and maybe it's even the scholarly work of CRT that happens to say if there is a white person that they have this ancestral guilt and all this, but I'm, and especially in the church maybe, but I'm not saying that. Simply what I'm saying is that there happens to be victimization currently of a certain people group, in this case Black people, and that white people even though it might not be inherent to their skin color or their genetics, they just by nature, because they're part of a group of people in modern day society who are privileged because of the cultural access that they have and the benefits that they have in society. Therefore, they need to share that in some way. And it doesn't mean that they have to harm themselves or financially or otherwise, but the best or most appropriate response is to at least help the poor, specifically of the person that that is negatively being affected in this system that they're benefiting from.
Yeah, okay. I don't see a problem with that.
So in this case,
you're going to enforce it through government, though? I think that's the issue.
Well, I think even in CRT defense, a lot of the times what they will say is that, and it's not necessarily coherent with some of the other statements, but give them the benefit of the doubt that they'll say it. So they'll go, okay, it's not, when they talk about race, so D'Angelo will talk about how race is just a social construct, that, black and white and those sorts of things. It's just, there's no biological evidence of race. And so, and people try to, historically they try to use biology to justify certain discrimination through race. And then, but what they'll pin onto is like things like whiteness or things like white supremacy are not necessarily attached to race. They're attached to certain ideologies that are probably found in certain races. So things like individualism, things like merit, things like accountability become, or rather not account, this responsibility.
Everything that was on that poster that you put up at the
exactly. Like, where did this come from?
Punctuality.
If you're reading through some of the scholarship, it makes sense because that's their list. So that would be some of their defense would be, well, actually, we're not referring to race. You kind of picked us up. Now, what's hard is because a lot of these same people will then fight for things like affirmative action, which is not an ideological litmus test. When you say, please specify what you believe in, individualism, merit, it's please denote your race, So that's where I think it becomes difficult. Where, okay, so race is now a reflection of ideology. So anyways, just to play devil's advocate, I think that's what a CRT scholar could say is, well, we're not talking about race, we're talking about ideology.
Right. Jacob, you wanted to say something.
So my tension is I'm trying to look at from a practical perspective. Okay, one of the questions that would come is that if race is seen purely as a construct, right? I mean, someone who holds to a CRT position would have to appeal to that. What is it that stops a person of certain race from migrating into another race? Right.
That's what I'm going to do.
That's a great question. Yeah. Oh, that was one of your other ones, wasn't it? One of the other 6. Like what, or like what if I decide, like, and especially with the whole, gender fluidity thing, like what about, and you're actually seeing jokes about this on YouTube now. If you look on YouTube, I've seen several of these where it's like, there was the last one I saw was a black guy who, and it was a parody, but he was identifying as a 35-year-old white guy named Jerry or something like that. And it was like, and he does like all the cultural stuff associated with like what that might look like with that stereotype or that trope. What's preventing people from just identifying as a different race, especially if it's a social construct.
And I think that there are a lot of like boundaries being created, or people restrict people on the basis of some idea that they have in their mind, right? That people can't actually cross into another race. Whereas there is no standard or foundation being provided as to, or direction being provided in terms of as to, or reason being provided in terms of why that cannot be done. Because if we are allowing for race to be a social construct, which it is, then in that case, we have to thereby naturally allow for people to then adopt certain criteria that would allow them to actually transfer onto or translate into a different race.
Right. Which would be an easy solution for some of us to get out of our current predicament.
But I think that makes it very interesting, because then now you're seeing that identity now is no longer in what you are, but what you've come to believe.
Well, and you're right, Logan. We almost unconsciously, subconsciously, not unconsciously, subconsciously
We'll have to knock you out first, Tony.
slipped into talking about race in the traditional way. See, this is why it's also such a tricky object to get a hold of, because again, we have to remember, and this is more, I'm going to skip to this 6th point and then maybe we'll wrap it up, or the 5th point here of, again, the critical race theorist is saying it's not white people, it's whiteness, right? It's the abstract object known as whiteness that bears certain properties. Believing a nuclear family is a God-ordained structure. Everything, self-sufficiency, as Willie James Jennings said, self-sufficiency is a property of whiteness. You got to go against that. I think on that poster that they put up in the Smithsonian, punctuality was an aspect of whiteness. Well, because we know what it's like in Southern Europe. The darker you get, the less on time you are. So it is.
Tony,
Yeah.
Can I add this? So
Sure.
here where the tension is, right? Some would claim that as a person of color, a brown person, I'm participating in that whiteness, right? I can do this one way. It's one directional. I can participate in whiteness, whereas you, as a white person, can't participate in my brownness.
You mean I can't?
Oh, you know what? That's actually
late for my
I never thought about
appointments.
that. An asymmetrical kind of yeah, that's really interesting.
Right. So my tension is there, and also when we're talking about this whole idea of race being construct, and race has cultural products. Now, some people have set boundaries around race, even though it's a construct, and you should be able to actually jump onto another race if it's a construct, if it's merely about how I think and the cultural products. Yeah. Why do I restrict a white person from braiding their hair, for example?
Yeah, who has that authority? Who has the authority to decide which social constructs somebody can have or not?
And why can't I actually, then we have to question the whole idea of, the whole idea of cultural appropriation. Is it even valid to question someone adopting a different culture and wanting to look like other culture or other race? Why are we setting those boundaries if race is a construct?
Yeah, it doesn't seem like you can logically hold to both race being a social construct and to appropriation of racial identity. That seems like a direct contradiction.
Well, I think it goes to the problem of just social constructivism in general. First define a society, or a culture. And there's no clear demarcation. I had a friend text me. He's like, someone was accusing me of white culture. Do you know what white culture is? I said, no, have them define it. He's like, they won't. They want me to define it because I'm a white person. I was like, well, what are they? Are they black? Tell them to define black culture for me. It's like, no one knows what any of these are. Is black culture the same for people living in South Africa, for the United States, Canada, Mexico? Okay, so is it American black culture? Is it, that's like Louisiana South? You have cultures. You can't arbitrarily this is it.
Because I don't know if it was in the Cartagena essay where it said something about ethnicity cannot be the object in view here, because one of the things that I think white people in America, people of European descent in America, forget the skin, the level of melanin, people of European descent, and this is happening with Mexican Americans as well. And we know the tragedy that this happened with Black Americans. We know that. That's what slavery did. It took people not just away from their families, but it displaced them from their home of origins and their ethnic cultures, right?
Yes.
And the way that happened for white Europeans coming to America is just over time, you lose your traditions. You lose your traditions. I'm half Italian. My mother's 100% Italian. What do I do that is uniquely Italian in my life? I put up a nativity set at Christmas. That's an Italian tradition. That's about it. It's getting, that's about it.
Yeah.
But you
Especially
got
now
some
that
pretty
everybody-
strong facial expressions. I don't know if that counts. You got to get the hands going too.
Well, is
I
that
have opinions. You have opinions that are pretty strong.
That's sort of a yeah, I don't even know if that's.
I think I look more Italian than you.
we can edit that out.
Especially now that everybody eats pizza, right? So it's like it's not like I'm the only one who eats pizza. It's only the Italians in Chicago and New York that eat pizza. Everybody eats pizza. They eat pizza in Japan. So it's like, I asked this question to Amos Young when he was speaking at Talbot a few years back. White cultures has no content in America. There's no content to it. Nobody's Irish anymore. Nobody's Italian or German anymore, even if you like a bratwurst. You don't do anything anymore that is unique to the culture that you descended from. You just don't. And that's happening to my Mexican friends too. Only the ones who maybe their parents came from Mexico still do certain things that are traditional to maybe even their region. But you get to the third generation, they're not doing the things that are typical of the people in Jalisco or Michoacan. They're just doing this, so, that's an inch that we could do another thing on that. But anyways, that was a little bit of a tangent or a digression.
No, but I think I think it points to two aspects of culture that most people just ignore when they talk about cultural appropriation, when you try to cross-identify and stuff like that, is displacement in over time. Yeah, like my family, go back, was from Italy. You go to the Bronx. There's the Zeppieri bakery. I talked to him. Found out my family's back in Rome, but I have this Rome culture.
Yeah.
No, there's no possible. Even if I wanted it, I go on YouTube watching things that Rome, ancient Roman Italians did in their homes. I mean, it's still not going to be the same because I'm just copying something I saw. I never actually lived with those people, had those sort of opinions, let alone accusing someone else.
Well, one of the things that then going back to whiteness as this sort of reified abstract object that bears certain properties that even Jacob could exemplify those properties. Jacob could exemplify whiteness by holding to certain views of the family or being on time for his appointments or whatever it may be, or being self-sufficient, whatever it may be. In Willie James Jennings' book, which I referenced last time, After Whiteness, he describes it as white masculinist self-sufficiency. And to get theological for a second, now I'm pretty sure that Dr. Jennings holds to some kind of correlation theory or a correlation method of theology, which we have spoken about before. But, one final point that we might say to the church specifically is, look, if whiteness has really sort of like a cancer embedded itself in our theology for the last 400 years, then we really need to stop evangelistic ministry to other cultures. Because until we weed out that whiteness, none of these all of these ministries are effectively preaching some kind of heresy to people in places like India, Africa, Asia, South America, and so on and so forth. This must stop. This is no better than if you were preaching Arianism or tritheism or some other ancient heresy. So that means your good old, like I use Through the Bible, J. Vernon McGee. That ministry that's run by Greg Harris, I think is the guy's name, and that is in like dozens of countries. And they specialize in getting the Bible into like, more like unreached people groups in places like India and Africa and stuff. They need to be shut down by somebody. Somebody needs to stop them.
And I
because
think
they're preaching whiteness.
And I think early church did a mistake, isn't it? Paul did go to the West. Yeah, he was asked to go to the West. whereas other disciples did go to the east. You know, just and they did a mistake, I believe, in doing that. Then we have to question the very early church and the disciples who went around the world preaching the gospel.
Yeah.
It brings up, I think, the question, like you're saying, Jacob, like, are there fundamental truths that no matter where you're from or what time you're in or what culture you might be practicing, you know, it's wrong. Aztecs shouldn't be sacrificing people in the same way the Canaanites shouldn't have been. It doesn't matter that you're on different continents or in different times.
Yeah.
You find human value.
We just need to get a copy of Abolition of Man and send it to every CRT proponent out there, and that'll solve the whole thing.
That's a book from a dead white male.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
Yeah. I think Lewis and Tolkien, church has got to be done with those guys. Well, look, maybe we'll continue this in the next session. I think there's still a lot more to be said. I agree with Logan. We probably do need to get into some specific authors. Of course, we've been a little tongue-in-cheek here, a little rhetorical. But we did that intentionally, I think, to try and draw out some of the some of the idea that this really is not an empirically based theory. This is just, in a sense, it's a lot of assertions at the end of the day without much to back it up evidentially. So on that note, then, we'll see you next time, and God bless.